Everyone. My name is Debbie Atchison. I am the president of the Blue Ridge chapter of NCMA. First, want to apologize to everyone for the short cancellation and reschedule. I had a death in the family and could not attend, so we had to reschedule everything. So I apologize for that. I'm glad everyone could join us today. A couple of things. We are going to hold all questions until the end. So please make sure you are on mute if you're not speaking so that we don't have any interruptions as we go along. Robert will get to as many questions as he possibly can. And those that we can't get to, we will get emailed back to those people to get their questions answered. As you know, this is being recorded, so we will have that available at the end as well. There will be poll questions as we go along. You need to make sure you answer these poll questions and provide the answers in order to get your certificate of attendance for those who want CPEs. Robert, what can I tell you about Robert? Well, Robert and I don't know each other that well personally. However, I have seen Robert in many NCMA events and webinars, and he's very, very knowledgeable when it comes to government contract accounting. In fact, he is now an author, and I bought the book, Government Contract Accounting Made Easy, the Uncomplicated Guide to Compliance, Pricing, and Profitability. I apologize, Robert. I have not read it yet. I haven't had a chance to, but I did flip through it. It has a lot of great information. It's in plain English and not in that legalese. So it's a wonderful tool to have sitting on your desk. But I can't say enough wonderful things about Robert. You read his bio in the flyer, so I won't repeat myself, but you want to take it away, Robert?
All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're joining from. Thank you, Debbie, for this opportunity. I'll just take a quick moment to remind everybody that in your browser window at the bottom, you've got a few different buttons. And if you hover over those, it'll tell you what they are. Just tell you to be sure to put your questions in the Q&A so that we don't lose those. It'll make sure that I've got time at the end to go through them. You guys can use the chat amongst yourselves or with Debbie, but if you put a question that you want answered in the chat, it might get lost if other people are chatting in there. So again, please just put your questions in the Q&A. There will also be some polling questions that pop up throughout, and I will highlight those. If you do respond to 5 of the 6 polling questions in today's webinar, you'll get an automatic CPE certificate emailed to you within about 48 hours. And with that, I will go ahead and dive into our content. All right, our topic today is cost and price analysis for government contractors. My name, again, is Robert Jones. I'm your presenter. The firm is Left Brain Professionals, and as Debbie said, I'm sure some of you have probably seen or heard me, maybe attended some of our other webinars in the past. We are a boutique accounting firm that works only with government contractors. Tell people that we practice all things DCAA, including indirect rates, incurred cost proposals, accounting systems, and audits. And a lot of what we do is what we're going to be talking about today in terms of helping our clients from a cost and pricing perspective. Our perspective is typically helping clients understand their costs and rolling that up to the price that they're going to charge their customer, but also helping them understand how they need to be able to support those prices and be able to support those costs so that when their customers are performing cost and price analysis, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, then they're going to be more successful in defending those costs and prices and more successful getting through audits and winning awards. All right, our learning objectives for today. I should be able to know the difference between cost analysis and price analysis, understanding what cost analysis is. We'll be talking about some price analysis techniques, the components of cost and price, documentation and compliance, and the basis of estimate and selecting a method of price analysis as part of everything. I'm going to go ahead and kick off the first polling question here, and let me get it on your screen. What is the primary goal of cost and price analysis? Is it to find the cheapest supplier, to ensure fair and reasonable pricing, to maximize company profits, or to comply with government regulations? I'd say there's a couple on here that look similar. Certainly one ideal or more correct answer on the screen. And though I would also say that there's probably a couple on here that factor into the cost and price analysis that companies perform. And with each poll-in question, I'll give you about a minute to respond so that we can get back to the content. Again, if you do respond to 5 of the 6 poll-in questions today, then you'll get a certificate at the end of completion. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this polling question and share the results on the screen. So the most correct answer, I will say, is to ensure fair and reasonable pricing. And I think most everybody got that correct. Right, when we talk about pricing in government contracts, right, that's a pretty common phrase that we hear is that, right, the contracting officer, or in the case when you're selling to a prime, the prime has a responsibility to make a determination of fair and reasonable pricing. And we'll talk about some of what they go through today to make that determination. First of all, let's talk about the difference between cost analysis and price analysis. So cost analysis is the process of evaluating cost, right? And some people oftentimes get the terms cost and price, I guess I would say confused or conflated. People often use the terms interchangeably, and they are different, right? The price is something that I pay for something. It could later become my cost, right? So if I buy something and I incorporate it into a product or service that I have, I pay a price, right, to obtain it. That becomes my cost, which then becomes, again, my cost if I am supporting that price to my customer. I may be in a situation where they are evaluating my cost elements. And again, we'll talk about some of that. The cost analysis is that evaluation of the individual underlying cost elements. And some of what they're looking for, right, is, in either way, whether we're looking at the price or the cost elements, right, are these fair and reasonable? Are the individual costs, do they make sense? Is the level of effort, the number of hours, the quantity of materials, all of those things obviously factor into the total cost or the total price of a product or service. Now, some of what we're going to talk about today is going to be, I'm going to try to keep it as clear as I can, but again, we're going to be, especially when we talk about a lot of cost stuff, as I said in my opening, we help clients understand their costs so that when they're pricing their product or service, that they're pricing it accurately and they're going to maximize profitability. But again, if they're in a situation where they are required to submit cost information, whether that's certified or other than certified cost or pricing data, that they can do so with accuracy and with confidence. Price analysis, on the other hand, is the evaluation of price without the evaluation of the underlying cost element. Now, I do want to pause here for a moment and clarify that that does not necessarily mean it's the total price of the contract, that is certainly, right, that is certainly one factor, but that oftentimes the government of the prime is still evaluating the price at the underlying levels. So what I'm saying is that if you're selling, say, services, maybe a series of services to the government, you're going to have, that could be broken out by CLIN, there could be labor categories by CLIN. The government, as you well know, often asks for that information by labor category, by CLIN, by phase, by year. Right? So oftentimes there's a lot of pieces that go in that roll up to what I call my total price down in the lower right-hand corner, right? But I've got all of these other columns and rows of information. So it's not just evaluating the total price at the bottom of the contract, at the bottom of the proposal down here, but it's also evaluating the price at the upper levels. And so I've got to look in here and say, okay, yeah, the total bottom line price seems to be reasonable, but if I look up above, are you overcharging me for a particular phase or a particular product or a particular labor category that's rolling up, right? I could determine that while, again, the total price of the proposal makes sense, maybe there's some prices up above that don't make sense. But that is, again, just clarifying that I'm looking at price level information. I'm not looking at cost level information. And part of the distinction there would be if I were looking at cost, I would be looking at base labor plus fringe plus overhead plus G&A plus the fee or profit that's proposed. Whereas at a price level, I would just be looking at what's the price per labor category that you're proposing. Hope that clarifies and makes sense to everybody. Price as well is often focused on the market price, right? What's the market willing to pay? What's your customer willing to pay? And it's not just an aspect of cost. Now, those of you who have heard me before, and I'll say it today, maybe even a couple of times today, one of the things that I teach clients and that I teach students in class is it doesn't matter what the price is if you don't understand the cost. And let me give you a couple of examples of that, because I hear some people who are not accountants pick on me and others in the accounting world say, you guys are only focused on the cost and you don't give consideration to price and what the market's willing to pay. And that's not a true statement, certainly not for me, because again, what I try to get everybody to understand is you have to look at everything from both sides, at least for you as the contractor, right? So again, the government, if they're only performing price analysis and they're not looking at cost, but you as the contractor really need to be looking at what are your costs and what is the price that the market's willing to pay. So again, quick example. I'm going to talk in terms of units, and that could be an hour, a product, doesn't really matter, but a unit of something that you're selling. Let's say the market is willing to pay $150 per unit. Well, one of the things that we do in working with clients is help them evaluate and properly calculate all of their costs, both direct and indirect, and roll those up and determine what is the cost for me to deliver that unit of product or service. If we roll up those costs and it's $148 per unit and the market is only willing to pay $150 per unit, does it make sense for you to sell that product or service at $150, right? At $2 margin on that, that might not be enough to keep you in business, right? That might not be enough profit to deal with taxes and cost overruns and other things that occur that eat into that profitability. And if we roll up those costs and it's $155 per unit, well, then obviously you're losing money on every unit of that that's going out the door. But we might also roll up all of those costs and maybe your costs are $100 per unit. And if you can sell it at $150 per unit, then that's a really nice margin. Now, the other factor that comes into play here is contract type, right? Because if it's a cost type contract and I roll up my costs and it's $100 per unit, and I'm going to tack on fee or profit of probably 8 to 10% with some limited exceptions on that in a cost type environment, then, my product is going to cost, or my service, either one is going to cost $110 per unit. If I'm in a fixed price environment, and particularly if it's like a commercial item and some other factors coming into play, and I can sell it for $150 per unit, but it only costs me $100 per unit, then that's a really great margin again for me to be able to sell that. And what I want you to walk away from here is, one, understanding that you need both pieces of information. You need to know what's happening in the market. What are others paying for that product or service? What are they willing to pay? What does it cost you? And then at some point, you also have to take into consideration the contract type and what that impact might be on the final price that you're able to negotiate. Key components of cost analysis. So when we talk about cost analysis, again, I said it's the evaluation of the underlying cost elements, which are broken down largely into two categories. And one are direct costs. Those are the costs that are directly attributable to that final cost objective. And oftentimes we're talking about raw materials or labor. More specifically, I break it down into 5 cost elements for direct costs, and that is labor, travel, materials, ODCs, and subcontractors. So those are my direct costs that I have incurred specifically for that project or that contract. My other big category are indirect costs, and we typically break those down into 3 categories of fringe, overhead, and G&A. Now, as a bit of a side note here, it is possible, depending on your industry and on your particular company, you could have multiple fringe pools. So we see companies that have SCA and non-SCA fringe as an example. You could have multiple overhead pools for engineering versus manufacturing, or location 1 versus location 2. You could have overhead broken out by product lines or service lines. We also see companies that have intermediate cost pools for things like facilities, HR, and IT. You may have a material and subcontract handling pool as a possibility. And then there's also G&A, right, which is those general and administrative costs, those costs to run the business as a whole. Today is not a deep dive into all of those. If you're interested, we've got several webinars on our YouTube channel. Make sure you get that link out to you in a follow-up email. You can simply go to YouTube and search for @leftbrainpro.com. You can also get the link from our website. But again, on our YouTube channel, we've got several other videos out here that do a deeper dive on indirect rates and all of those various cost pools. And it's important to have at least a very basic understanding of that here, because again, if we're doing cost analysis, whether internal of our own costs, whether we are performing cost analysis for subs, right? So we may be in a situation where we are subbing out, right? We've got subcontracts out to other companies. We are performing price and or cost analysis on those subs. And so it's good to have an understanding of what is the information that they're submitting to us and how do we evaluate that information. A couple of other ways that we look at cost analysis is the difference between fixed costs, and those are costs that, as they sound, are fixed in nature. And we say either change or really have limited change. So typically we're talking about a lot of things like rent, insurance, salaries. Again, if we've got people on staff that are on hourly, can be utilities, maintenance and repair, and other types of costs that we're going to incur. And those costs are largely not going to change regardless of the amount of work that we perform. Variable costs, on the other hand, are those costs that do vary based upon the quantity of product or service that we sell. Right. So, for example, if I'm selling more product, then I'm going to have more materials that go into that. If I've got a lot of direct work, I'm going to have more direct labor. I'm going to have more direct travel. And obviously, if I'm in if we're in a downturn, if we've lost a contract, if we're waiting for a contract to be awarded, then in theory, right, my direct costs are lower, my variable costs are lower in that type of situation. What's the importance in business for this? Budgeting and cost control, understanding, again, the internal aspect of cost analysis, setting budgets, monitoring those budgets, and making sure that we stay in line with those budgets. It helps us to control costs, either whether they're direct or indirect costs, right? We should be putting together budgets for direct projects that we do, and then measuring our performance against those budgets. They inform our pricing decision, right? The thing that I've said already a couple of times is the importance and the need to understand our internal costs so that we develop an accurate price for our products and services. And one of the things you'll hear me say, not so much even a joke, but I tell people that we don't get clients calling us saying, hey, I've got a whole lot of money. Can you help me get it in the barrel and get it to the bank? They're calling us because they're saying, we're doing this work, we're delivering product, we're delivering service, and there's either not much money left at the end of the month. We know we've got evidence that we're losing money on a product or on a contract. We're not winning as many awards. We're having competitive pricing issues. And so those are the things that are signals to us that the company doesn't understand all of their costs. They may not be calculating and tracking their indirect rates. They may have errors in their indirect rate calculations. They could be doing pricing decisions without looking at and giving full consideration to the costs. So there's a lot of factors at play here. Again, really important to understand those costs when developing the price. And obviously, all of this is financial health for the organization. If you're in a situation with narrow profit margins, reduced profit margins, maybe you're breaking even, as a company, you can't function that way, right? You don't have profitability to the owners, and you don't have cash flow to keep working capital in the business, right? Profitability is not just about putting money in the pockets of the owners. It's also about being able to float AR and being able to fund the next project as it starts while we're waiting to be able to bill that customer and to get the cash from that project. That profitability goes towards internal investments, infrastructure in the business, marketing, advertising, R&D, other types of things. And if we're not building prices that maximize profitability, then we're impacting the financial health of the organization. What are some challenges in cost analysis? Accurate cost allocation. Something that we uncover all of the time is that clients, they're either not putting dollars into the correct buckets or they're not allocating them out correctly. And we also see this on the reverse side of performing cost analysis. So we're going to see again back and forth today on both sides of the table of this, right? As a contractor, you're rolling up your cost to understand your price. You may be rolling up costs because you have to deliver cost information to your customer. But as a government contractor, you also many times are asking and receiving cost information from your subs, or certainly price information, but sometimes as well cost information. And so you need to understand how all of these pieces of the puzzle work and how to interpret them. And in the world of cost allocation, again, we find that people are sometimes not consistent in how they treat a cost, meaning that sometimes they treat it as direct and sometimes they treat it as indirect. That's an incorrect approach. We might find that sometimes they treat it as overhead and sometimes they treat it as G&A. Again, an incorrect approach. It needs to be consistent. We also find that there are problems in the way the indirect rates are built and how they're allocated. And if you are analyzing the cost, evaluating the cost information provided to you by one of your subs, you might uncover the same thing, meaning that you might find that there's an error in the way they're allocating fringe, or an error in the way they're allocating overhead or G&A or their M&SH pool, something like that. And that's another area where, and so there are different reasons for that. Sometimes either there's a fundamental misunderstanding. There could have been just an unfortunate error in how it was built. Oftentimes, though, what we find is that there's a disconnect between the accounting and the pricing group, meaning that the accounting group may be properly calculating the indirect rates internally, but the pricing group may be applying those rates incorrectly on a proposal. And I probably could come up with some different examples, but for example, overhead, oftentimes, certainly in service organizations, is applied to direct labor plus the applied fringe. And so if you're calculating indirect rates that way, then when you build up your pricing structure, you need to do it the same way. So what we might find is that somebody erroneously applies overhead only to the direct labor and forgets to apply it to the applied fringe, which means then that they're going to have missed that in their roll-up. And then they end up with a price that's incorrect, right? It might look like a great price, like, wow, we're really competitive. But then we work backwards and discover later that there was an error in that roll-up over here because the two teams internally did not communicate correctly and somebody wasn't reviewing how that price was rolled up. Adapting to cost variability, responding to fluctuations in costs, especially variable and indirect costs. Again, goes back to some of this internal cost management, whether it's direct costs. And so, hey, this is what we proposed. This is what it's really costing us. Are we on track with that? Do we have ways to mitigate these cost variations? And again, that could also apply to our indirect costs, right? We put together budgets. Our proposed or budgeted indirect rates are based upon these budgets. We need to manage those costs and have mitigation strategies in place. And it really goes here to this managing overheads of, again, proper calculation and allocation of overhead costs. This is, again, when clients call and they say we're having competitive pricing issues or we're having issues with profitability, that 9 times out of 10, it's an error in the calculation and allocation of overhead costs. All right, talk a little bit about diverse methods of price analysis techniques. Price analysis involves various techniques to determine the fairness and reasonableness of a price. And it's essential for strategic purchasing, contract negotiations, and competitive pricing. And probably more importantly, in the world of government contracts, right, we have a set of rules to follow. We have specific price analysis techniques that we're supposed to perform and document as part of our work. Right, with that though, another polling question up here. And poll question number 2 is up. Which technique is commonly used in price analysis? Is it historical price comparison, cost estimation, market share analysis, break-even analysis? And again, give people just a few more seconds here to respond to the polling question. So take advantage of that so you can work towards getting a CPE certificate today for completing the course. I do see there's a question that came in. Yes, we will get a copy of the slide deck out to everybody at the end. Part of the follow-up email, there'll be information in there on that. All right, I'm going to publish the results. Looks like most people have responded. So probably, again, this is one of those that in the reality, people are looking at various price techniques and price analysis techniques, and we're going to go into those in a moment. But obviously, historical price comparison is certainly one of the more common ones, right? Again, we're talking about price analysis, so I wouldn't be doing cost estimation. The market share that somebody has is irrelevant, right? Just because they're a larger company. And break-even analysis, again, if we're talking about price, we wouldn't know whether somebody is breaking even or otherwise in their organization. All right, 7 key price analysis techniques. We can find this information in the FAR. You're probably familiar with competitive bidding or what we call adequate competition. And so prices are analyzed by comparing quotes or bids from 2 or more responsible bidders. And ideally, right, because we've got 2 or more responsible bidders, and if I'm picking a price within there, the market has told me these are fair and reasonable prices. Again, the potential issue here could be that you have a wide variety of prices. But again, our guidance is that if we've got 2 or more responsible and responsive bidders, then ideally I've got adequate competition, and the price that I choose is deemed fair and reasonable because of that. And this works well, right, where there are many suppliers in an open market. If we get into situations where it's a single sole source type of acquisition, then obviously I don't have competition, and this type of analysis doesn't work for me. So then I start to go through the list and I say, okay, what other price analysis techniques can I use to determine if I'm getting a fair and reasonable price? Historical pricing, right? So what did we pay for the same or similar items in the past? Can be very helpful if we've got recurring purchases, maybe long-term contracts. A couple of things to keep in mind though with historical pricing, and I've got a couple of examples to share around this, is, and again, whether you are using historical pricing internally to evaluate your subcontractors and suppliers, or whether you're going to go to the government and say, hey, yes, we might be a sole single source situation, but this is what you've paid in the past. Again, can be helpful. There are some fallacies in historical pricing. For example, one fallacy is that, let's say if the government is buying it on a regular basis, maybe it's something they're buying every month, every couple of months. Maybe even if I'm a government buyer and I'm buying same or similar products or services from different vendors on a regular basis, again, then I've got some good historical information and I can say, okay, yeah, you want $395 per unit, and and I can look and see over the last year I've been paying anywhere from $385 to $410 per unit. Even though I don't have anybody else who's competitive on this right now, I can see that I've got historical pricing, right, that you are in line with that historical pricing. So what's a fallacy? Historical pricing that is dated typically more than 12 to 18 months. Some people say a hard 12 months. Here, some people say 12 to 18 months. But when you get beyond 12, certainly 12 to 18 months in historical pricing, right, a lot has changed. A lot has changed in the economy, inflation, raw material prices. I mean, there's so much going on that relying on old historical information is probably not good. Another problem with historical pricing is that we also need to make sure that we're doing an apples to apples comparison, meaning that I'm looking at same or similar quantities under the same or similar terms and conditions and economic environment. Let me give you a perfect example. company I used to work for, we used to sell relatively low volumes of stuff, but we sold volume of product to the government. Often, not huge volumes, but it might have been tens, meaning they might have bought 50 or 60 or 70 of something from us. These are larger, high dollar items. These were high-end electronics of, $100,000 to $200,000 each. So the government might buy 50, 60, 70 of these at a time, and they would get pricing at those quantity levels. I don't remember our exact quantity breaks, but we had quantity breaks at like 10 and 25 and 50 and something else. And so, right, if they were buying 60 or 70, then they were getting our quantity 50 pricing, which might have been our best pricing. If they come back even within that 12 to 18 months, and I had this happen one time, we tried to sell the government and say, you've always bought spares when you bought this product. You need to be buying spares now. And the government said, no, we don't want to buy any spares. We don't want them on this contract. And we're like, okay, that doesn't make sense. You always buy spares. We don't know why you're not buying spares. And lo and behold, they came back about 9 months later and said, oh, you know what? We've decided we'd like to buy 2 spares now. And we said, great, here's your quote. And the price for the 2 spares was significantly higher. I don't remember exactly how high, but it was significantly higher, maybe 2x, close to 2x of the original. And the government nearly lost their mind. And they're like, well, what are you guys doing? And and again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like, hey, we just paid $75,000 per unit when we bought those 50. And now you want $125,000 per unit for these 2 spares. And we just bought these 9 months ago. And we said, yeah, you bought quantity 50 before, and now you're buying quantity 2. This is not a product that we have sitting on the shelf. We make it when you buy it. So when you came back and ordered 2, we have to go to our suppliers. And guess what? We're going to order quantity 2 of the necessary parts. Their prices are higher on low quantities. Our prices are higher on low quantities, right? We have to restart the assembly line and do stuff. And so that's an impact on that type of stuff. So that's one aspect of historical pricing to keep in mind, is we need to make sure that we're considering same or similar quantities, again, under same or similar circumstances, including the terms and conditions of the contract. Parametric estimating is where we use some statistical relationships between historical data and other volumes. We were able to use this a couple of times in supporting our price to the government when we sold a modularized electronic black box. At the high level, these black boxes did largely the same thing, but there were some different functions and features available depending on which modules that you chose. And so the government would sometimes come along and say, okay, well, we bought the version ABC before, and this time we'd like to buy version BCD with some different modules. And we'd say, okay, so here's the price. And they would say, well, wait a minute, why is this price, and oftentimes it was higher because they were wanting more features and functions. They would say, well, why is it, so much more expensive? And we would say, okay, well, one of the things we could do is, from a technical perspective, we would say, well, the other box did these things at these speeds and this bandwidth and whatever else some of those technical things were. And we'd lay it out side by side and we'd say, okay, this box processes 10% faster than this one, and the bandwidth is 10% narrower, which is a higher fidelity type of thing, right? And so we would go down through and we would say, okay, this box is 10% more expensive or 15% more expensive because of this comparison. And so that's one potential way to show parametric estimating. Competitive published price lists. These tend to be very difficult in the world of price analysis, just because many companies don't publish price lists. For competitive reasons, they don't publish their price lists. And so it's very difficult to have that information certainly readily available. But the one piece of advice I do give clients and that I teach people is, while you may not publish the price list on your website, you can have an internally published price list. And so one of the things that you can do is have a price list. And what I tell people is convert it to a PDF, put a digital signature on it, which is going to have a date and time stamp, and use that to show this is our price. This was our starting point in developing that price. Now, is it published? No. Does it help in somebody determining that your price is fair and reasonable, and specifically that you didn't just, hey, wait a minute, you sent us a couple of pages from your price list, but how do I know that you didn't just increase the price for us and I don't know what you're charging somebody else? Fair and reasonable question, right? So one thing we can do is we can say, look, this is our price list. We publish it every, we update it every year. We put a digital signature on it with a date and timestamp so that you can see I didn't just update it last night before submitting this proposal. The other thing you want to have in your price list, though, is you also want to include various terms and conditions, warranties, what your price breaks are, what those quantity breaks, anything that you use to affect pricing. All of that information needs to be in your price list. And at the very least, you should be willing to share, if not the entire price list, with a customer. Certainly those aspects that are generic to all prices in the catalog, as well as the information that's relevant to their specific product or service that they're buying. So one way to have a price list that can, I'm not going to say that it's a guarantee, but it is one tool that can certainly help to support your price when somebody else is evaluating your price. Independent government cost estimates. So this is where the government has put together, so they've used their own internal accounting and proposal development teams of sorts to come up with, I don't want to say a should cost, but it's kind of like a should cost, but it's the independent government cost estimate. What we have found in our experience and in talking to other people, independent government cost estimates can take time, and there's some debate out there. Some people think that they're really good, and there's certainly plenty of independent government cost estimates that have been way off the mark. And so what do? If you have an independent government cost estimate, but now you've got an actual proposal from a contractor in front of you and there's a significant variance, how do you reconcile that? Can't necessarily just go to the contractor and say, well, the IGCE is 30% less than you need to lower your price 30%. Well, that's not necessarily true. That doesn't necessarily mean that the contractor's price is wrong. It could very well be that the IGCE is wrong, that maybe they haven't considered the appropriate geography or other factors that go into affecting a contractor's cost that's rolled up to their price. Market research. So I do want to say, just as a reminder, that the contracting officer and the prime are supposed to be doing market research regardless. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have all of the pricing information to make a determination that the price is fair and reasonable by market research alone, but that market research is, I should be looking to the market. What are the typical terms and conditions? What are the prices for similar products and services that are out there? Also note that when we're talking about government contracts here and these 7 price analysis techniques, we are working in order with what's in the FAR. And so ideally, we would have adequate competition and we would stop there and be done. When we don't have adequate competition, then we start working our way down the list until we get to the point that we have the appropriate information that can support our determination of fair and reasonable price. Now, here is where things get a little sticky, and that is sometimes the government or the prime kind of go through all those steps and they say, I still don't have enough information to make a determination of fair and reasonable price. So then what do? It's analysis of other than certified cost or pricing data. Could be a situation where, again, government is trying to do price analysis. This is not a cost type contract. They're not awarding based upon cost, but they've gone through every other technique and there's just nothing to support the determination of a fair and reasonable price. And so they request other than certified cost or pricing data. And my caution here to the contractors side is may very well be what you would otherwise submit for certified cost or pricing data. It's just not certified, and that it's just not certified is not a minor thing, right? Having certified cost or pricing data means that you are certifying that it is accurate and complete, and that if you find other additional information, you're supposed to go back and provide that information to the government. And if the government later determines that you did not provide all of the information to their detriment, then you could be found in a situation of defective pricing, right? So that certified cost or pricing data is a very key thing. Here we're talking about other than certified cost or pricing data. And the point that I want to drive home is that it very well may be the exact same data, and probably is, but without the certification. And again, this is where, and we see this in single sole source situations where the government is saying, I don't have the competition, there's not a big market for this product or service. We've only bought it from you for the last 5 years, so I don't have historical information from somebody else, right? We start looking and we go through all these other techniques. I don't have a way to determine what's a fair and reasonable price. So the only thing I can do is ask you to submit cost details that I could then use to determine that it's a fair and reasonable price. There's a specific scenario and application for each of these. The one thing that I want to drive home on the next slide here is it's really important to select one method. And this is a concept that sometimes is very confusing, especially to contractors who are evaluating their subs and their suppliers, is they say, well, wait a minute, I didn't have adequate competition, but I had historical prices that were 2 years old, and I had a little bit of market research, and I had a little bit of something else. Man, if I use all of these and cobble them together, isn't that better, right? I've got data from 2 or more things. Isn't more better? And the answer is no, not in the world of doing price analysis and having a defendable price analysis, right, when the government comes to audit you, because what we're saying here is that if you're having to cobble together 2 or more arguments, then there's obviously some fallacies. There's something that's not solid in 1 or more of those arguments, right? So that means I should be focused on one method that gives a solid foundation to my solid support to my determination of fair and reasonable price. Now, here's the other reality that we know happens, and we can admit it, and the government is aware of this at times, but unfortunately, sometimes as a buyer, we're left that somebody else told us you will buy that product or that service from that vendor. And sometimes there are other reasons, right? We say above my pay grade that somebody else has made that decision, right or wrong, different conversation. But sometimes buyers are left sitting there saying, okay, I was told I had to buy from this vendor. I've got a, excuse me, but I've got a pile of poop, right, that was dropped on my desk, and I'm trying to make the prettiest out of this that I can. And sometimes that's very difficult, right? Because sometimes when we go through those various techniques, we don't have a really good argument, and we're left trying to cobble together 2 or 3 arguments. Again, focus on finding the best single argument and use that to stand on. At the end of the day, your source selection and your price analysis should stand on their own. And when an auditor comes behind you and evaluates that, they should come to the same conclusion as you, right? There should be a clean set of facts that somebody can read through, that they can walk through. And when they get to the end of your file, they say, yep, I understand why they selected that vendor. And I agree for the same reason that it was a fair and reasonable price. If I get to the end of your file and I can't say those 2 things, then there's a problem, right? And that's where we see from a CPSR perspective why some companies get in trouble. All right, what are some factors affecting cost and price components? So we've got a poll question here, so let me go ahead and launch this. Poll number 3. So what factor can significantly affect the cost component of a price? Is it brand reputation, material costs, customer service quality, or marketing strategy? And again, we'll give you about a minute to respond to the poll in question. All right, just a couple more seconds here. It looks like most people have voted. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and publish the result. All right, so what factor can significantly affect the cost component of a price? Well, obviously material costs, right? Now, my brand reputation, my customer service quality, my marketing strategy might affect my price and why somebody chooses me or doesn't choose me, but a factor affecting the cost component would be my material costs. All right, factors affecting cost and price. What are some impacts? Market dynamics. I think that most people know that There's things going on out in the market. There could be a lot of competition for the product or service that I'm selling. And so that's where I go back to when guiding clients, we have to know what your costs are and what the price is that the market is willing to bear. And that's true regardless really of competition, but it's really, really important in the world of competition, right? It's really important that, hey, the market price for something is $150 per unit, and there's, a dozen other companies selling in that range, right? They're all in the 145 to 155 range. And if I'm going to be successful and win some of those contracts, I know my price has to be in that range. If it's higher than that, then I'm not going to be competitive and I'm not going to win. Next item up, economic factors, right? So what's going on in the economy? Is there inflation? Are there supply chain issues? And, those have been in the conversation for a long time, but certainly when we went through COVID, those were big factors. Inflation continues to be a topic of interest. So some people think the inflation is slowing, but there's still, I just was reading or listening to a news article the other day saying that economists are saying all these positive things about the economy, but people are saying, yeah, I'm not feeling that. It doesn't feel positive. I don't feel like I'm getting ahead like you think I should be getting ahead right now. There are obviously factors out there that are affecting the cost of what we buy and then what we can sell. Supply chain issues right now, big thing going on is the move around shipping channels, right? And what's happening over in the Middle East. And so right now, right, shipping companies are having to go down around Africa instead of going through the Red Sea. And so that is affecting the time of getting product from one place to another. It's also affecting the cost of getting product from one place to another, right? It almost doubles the time and the distance. And so that's a big impact from a supply chain perspective. There can obviously also be compliance changes that are going on right now, been going on for a while, but continues to be a point of contention is all of the CMMC stuff, right? And it's a compliance issue for government contractors. It's the time that it's taking them to get compliance as well as the cost of getting compliant. And both of those are going to affect my ability as a contractor to be able to buy products and services from those companies, which I guess ties into the regulatory environment. Again, here we could be talking about FAR or DFARs. We could also be talking about whether that's CMMC, other regulations outside, right? So whether it's, I say outside of specifically government contractors, but if I'm a company that deals in chemicals, as an example, I've got EPA regulations to deal with. There's changes, coming in that world as well. Technological advancements. What is the government buying and how does that affect what I'm selling? How does it affect how I operate my business? Talked a little bit about this before, but I do want to revisit a little bit, what are the components that go into price? We talked about this from a cost perspective some, but they are the components that go into the price. Now, again, just to be clear, it's just in the world of price analysis, I'm supposed to be analyzing price, not the underlying cost elements. And I do also want to clarify something that I should have said earlier in that what we've seen sometimes is that, and I've seen this from the government and I've seen it from primes, so they'll say, well, we're doing price analysis, but you need to tell us the fee or profit that you put into your price. No, that's incorrect. You're doing price analysis. You're analyzing the price. The fee or profit that I've built into my price is a cost component. And so if you were legitimately doing cost analysis, then I would have to share my direct cost plus my fringe, overhead, G&A, and my fee or profit. You're doing price analysis, you're evaluating price, not any of those underlying costs. But again, in the world of price, I've got cost components. I have my direct costs that we've talked about earlier. Labor, material, travel, ODCs, subcontractors. My indirect costs, and talking more than just overhead, but fringe, overhead, G&A. Again, many companies that we see have intermediate cost pools. They have the MSOH. as an example, and really just can't stress the importance of having indirect rates that are accurately calculated with an appropriate allocation method. Profit margin is always an interesting topic in the world of government contracts. So I do like to clarify to people, I've got a blog post about this that seems to get a bit of traffic at times. And that is that there are very few and limited regulatory guidelines around profit. Specifically, when we're talking about R&D contracts, that's limited to 15% of estimated costs. For all other cost type contracts, it's limited to 10% of estimated costs. And for architect and engineer contracts, it is not a limit on profit. It's within the same area of the FAR, but it is not a limit on profit. It simply says that the A&E costs cannot exceed 6% of the total project to build, for example, a bridge. So it's not a limit on profit, it's a limit on the cost of A&E. Those are the only cost or profit price type of regulations in the FAR, DFARS. Now, that does not mean that there's an unlimited profit margin that you can tack on, but certainly in the world of fixed price contracts, commercial products and services, again, it's going to be driven by, is the price fair and reasonable, which is again largely driven by what's going on in the market. And so the nice thing is, if the market price, back to my scenario earlier, if the market price is $150 per unit, and I can sell it for $150 per unit, and the government says that's a fair and reasonable price, and we're willing to pay that, my costs, and therefore as well my profit margin to the government or to the prime, is irrelevant. And part of that is a risk to me, especially again in a fixed price contract. I'm agreeing to sell and deliver that product or service at that price at the agreed upon schedule and location. And it's up to me how I manage my costs to be able to do that and to do that profitably. If my costs happen to be $100 per unit and I can make a $50 margin doing it, then why shouldn't I be able to do that? Again, assuming that that's a fair and reasonable price. Now, if it costs me $148 per unit, okay, I'm making a $2 margin, but that may not, again, be enough margin to cover that risk that I'm taking, right? Selling that at a fixed price, meaning that if I've got a cost overrun somewhere, if I've got overtime, if I've got a material cost increase, if I've got scrap or something that affects that, then I may not have enough profit margin to deal with some of those fluctuations and issues that come up. But profit is always an interesting conversation. The other thing that I would say, and what frustrates me, we see this oftentimes with our clients in the cost type world, is that, and I understand that there are people who say, well, just because there's a 10% max doesn't mean I should give 10% on those cost type contracts. But unfortunately, what we see happen is we see contractors, and sometimes they accept the work because they're hungry and they're starving and they want work. And so they'll begrudgingly accept, sometimes as low as 3 and 4%. I don't see that much, but I've seen some crazy things. But it's not uncommon for contractors to accept 6% fee on a cost type contract. And it's just not much. Again, when we consider that taxes have to be paid out of that. Even on a cost type contract, I can still have cost overruns and things that aren't covered. I've got internal funding that I've got to deal with, right? I've got my own R&D potentially that maybe even though it's part of my G&A, but I have other factors that I need to consider, none the least of which is working capital. And when I have unallowable costs and taxes and some other things that begin to chip away at that 6%, all of a sudden 6% doesn't go very far. And so it's very unfortunate that we see that. Related to that, what I would say, the other thing is that we see contractors accept award fee cost type. So they'll accept a CPAF, a cost plus award fee type of contract. And in that situation, they may accept an award fee total of 6%, meaning that they might get a guaranteed 3% with invoicing. They can get up to another 3% based upon the award factors, but oftentimes they're not getting that full extra 3%. So even though they think they might be getting 3%, even though they might think they're getting 6% or even up to 8%, they're not realizing that because of the factors going into the award fee portion of that. So another thing to consider in the profit margin conversation. All right, let's talk about documentation compliance in price analysis. Really, really important to have thorough and complete documentation, whether or not you are required to go through the CPSR or not. Having those policies and procedures in place is good for you, good for business. And even if you don't have to go through the CPSR, going through fact finding on a proposal that you submit, going through any type of audit, and being able to support, again, how you made that determination of fair and reasonable price and how and why you selected that particular vendor is really, really important. Many times you will be required to submit this with your cost proposal. If you're submitting a cost proposal to the government, you have to provide that detailed information as part of that. And we're also going to talk a little bit about using a compliance matrix in government contracting. Before we do that, our fourth polling question today, let me get that on the screen for you. Why is documentation important in price analysis? To track changes in market trends, to provide evidence of fair pricing practices, to facilitate employee training, or to assess the effectiveness of marketing campaigns. You can take advantage of the Q&A panel. If you've got a question, pop it in the Q&A panel. We do have a lot of information on our website, leftbrainpro.com. As I mentioned earlier, we also have about 50 recorded videos. This one will be recorded and made available to you as well. We have about 50 recorded webinars out on our YouTube channel, and they are sorted by topic. So there are several playlists out there, and they cover all aspects of government contract accounting, from chart of accounts and indirect rates through cost pools and strategy and pricing and other things. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. All right, looks like most people have responded to this poll question. I'm going to go ahead and close it and publish the results. And obviously, the thing that we keep talking about today is fair and reasonable pricing. And we do need documentation to support that as part of any audit or fact finding by the government. The importance of accurate and thorough documentation, transparency, and accountability are critical for really establishing trust. There's some things that I see happen, and I'll probably share a couple of stories and see how they flow through all of the things that we'll talk about on the next couple of slides here. So some things that I see happen in proposals when clients contact us. And oftentimes, unfortunately, contractors are contacting us after they have submitted a proposal and they're kind of in trouble and they're trying to figure out how to get out of trouble. So how are they getting in trouble? They didn't follow what was written in the RFP, and so they didn't provide all of the information requested. They didn't provide it in the appropriate format. They didn't provide it in the appropriate level of detail. I used to work for a gentleman, and he would drive me crazy because we would go through the proposals, and it would be very clear, and go through the RFP, and it would say, you need to submit this information by CLIN, by labor category, by year. It needs to be in Excel. It has to have the formulas. And he would say, I'm not doing that. 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 And then he would put it all in a PDF and send it to them. And every time our primes would come back just screaming, furious with us, like, we can't evaluate this. You're not giving us the information that we requested and that we need to make a determination. You didn't give it to us in Excel. And then he would say, okay, well, I'll give it to you in Excel, but I'm not giving you any formulas. And I can tell you, because the prime said to us, we're really beginning to not trust you because you're not sharing the appropriate information that we need to make a determination of fair and reasonable price. And I've also just found that in my personal life, and I found that in my business. Transparency really is critical to trust, because even if somebody disagrees with you, if they trust you and they believe that you have shared all of the relevant information, they're more likely to continue that trust and to continue the engagement with you. Obviously, justifying your pricing decisions, right? That transparency of how did you get there? Why did you choose that supplier? How did you get to that price? And again, a lot of this is stuff that's applicable, whether it's price analysis or cost analysis, but providing clear information that shows how you got to the total number. We've seen too many people do back of the napkin calculations. We had a client call last year, and they were an existing client. They didn't tell us they were working on a proposal. They didn't get our help with it. They submitted something to the government. And the government came back with a whole slew of questions because things didn't make sense. And so they called us up and they said, hey, can you help us explain this to the government? And I'm like, okay, well, I guess we can try. Show me what you did. And unfortunately, and again, this is stuff that we see happen, is they basically knew the government had a $10 million budget. I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like that. The government had a $10 million budget for this project. They knew the price. Their indirect rates were wonky, not that they were wrong. And when I say they're wonky, they were just in their small business. They were going through some large growth. They had some investing and some other things going on. And so the rates were accurate, but they had really high overhead and G&A rates. And so if you were to take their base cost, right, and roll things up, and this was a cost type situation, their cost would have been like $15 or $16 million. And they said, well, there's no way we can do that. And so when they were showing me stuff and they were showing me these weird numbers, I said, well, and what some of this didn't come out until later. I said, well, how did you get to this? And they said, well, we knew the government was only going to pay $10 million. So we just worked backwards through our rates and it came up to these, that these are the hours that we have. And I said, well, that, from what I know, like that's a really low number of hours. Like, is that enough hours for you to get the work done? And they said, no, it's like half of what we need. And I said, well, then how can you submit a proposal with only half the hours that you need to do the work if it's not going to be enough hours? So then one of the other things we also discovered was that they didn't update their rates to include the fact that they were going to win this work, which is another aspect of pricing that when you're building indirect rates and you're doing this, yes, you might have a budgeted set of indirect rates, but if you're putting together a proposal, and in this case, it was going to like double or triple the size of their business overnight, that's going to change your indirect rates. You have to develop new budgeted indirect rates for that proposal as if you had won that work. And so when we did the correct things and rolled it up, it still came out to a number that was higher than what the government's original budget was, but we had a solid thing with a basis of estimate, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. They had a solid proposal that was defendable, right? Because can you imagine being in front of a government auditor and they say, okay, well, how did you get to that number of hours? And they say, well, we just worked backwards and that's the number we came up with. That is completely the wrong answer, but it's unfortunately what we see happen, right? So we have to build things up logically and clearly, and we have to share that information so that we have a defendable, supportable price to our customer. Internally, this type of stuff aids in understanding our past pricing strategies, right? How did we get to this process? Kind of already talked about this, being ready for an audit, right? I mean, what we regularly see is that contractors will win a series of small contracts, meaning maybe $100,000, $200,000, $500,000, right? Relatively small stuff. And they don't get a lot of scrutiny. They don't get a lot of questions. And then all of a sudden the government says, hey, you're really good at this. Here's this $5 million opportunity. We want you to bid on it. And then so they bid on it with that same mentality of bidding on a $500,000 contract. And again, they don't put all of this in there. And now all of a sudden, because they've tripped over these dollar thresholds, the government is saying, yeah, we've bought from you before, but now you're going to be subject to truthful cost or pricing data. You're going to, this has to go through audit. This has to go through other things. And they're not ready for that, right? You've got to be ready for the audit. You've got to adhere to these regulations. You've got to be prepared to deal with, hey, wait a minute, this is now going to be over the TCPD threshold. I'm going to be subject to certified cost or pricing data, right? And that can lead to, could potentially lead to legal challenges in the future. Hopefully not, but that is a possibility. It gives you credibility. And we keep talking here with government agencies, but it's credibility with your customer, period. Whether you're a prime dealing directly with the government, whether you're a sub dealing to other primes, right? If I'm buying from you and on a regular basis, I get the information that I need in the level of detail, in the format provided, and that You've given me all the information so that I can logically follow it through myself and get to the same result. That builds credibility with you. I trust you as a supplier. I know that you're doing the right thing and that we're all on the same page. Facilitates clear communication during the process and makes negotiations easier, right? Because that's the other thing that happens is we get into these larger dollar contracts, these larger projects overall, then we often end up in situations where, okay, we've submitted a proposal, you've selected us, whether there was and even with competition, we might go into negotiations. Without competition, we go into negotiations. Again, and this was one of the struggles I had with the former employer, was that we would end up at the negotiating table. And part of the way we ended up at the negotiating table was that it wasn't even so much negotiations, it's that the prime was so frustrated with us that we wouldn't give them what they asked for, that the only thing they could do was say, okay, we're going to have, and I'm going to use my air quotes of negotiations. It was another way for them I don't think it was really true negotiations. It was them trying to get more of the information we should have provided to begin with. But if we provide that up front, then we all go to the negotiation table, right? And that process is easier at that point. Quick overview of cost-based versus value-based pricing. Cost-based pricing is what we've talked about in terms of calculating the cost and doing a cost roll-up approach. We tack on a markup or a profit, right? And that's the price, right? When we think in the world of cost-type contracts, right? Cost plus fixed fee, cost plus award fee, we're rolling up our costs. And I go back to my scenario earlier. My costs are $100 in a cost type contract. I'm going to get $100 plus whatever I negotiate for fee or profit. If it happens to be and we've got a quick example here, right? Price, my direct plus indirect cost plus my desired profit, we say divided by quantity. That gives me my price per quantity, but that gets me to what my price is. Versus in the world of value-based pricing or market-based pricing, right? It's what is the market willing to pay? Now, this is obviously going to be in a case where there's competition in the marketplace, right? There are multiple providers of this product or service. And that price isn't necessarily driven by costs. I mean, the underlying, we do know, right? As suppliers' costs go up, then their prices are going to go up. And we assume everybody's prices are going to go up. And so we still have market-based pricing. But right, market-based prices, I can even use my services as an example. We know what the market is willing to bear for our type of price. Would I like to make 2x per hour of what I make right now? Sure, who wouldn't, right? I mean, I could buy a house, a bigger house. I could buy a boat. I could buy something else. I could do that, but that's only if I could actually sell that service at that price, right? And I probably can't because, right, there are plenty of other people selling at a similar price to what I'm selling right now. So that's that market-based price. Other things that go into value-based pricing that's tied in with this concept are the perceived value of what's selling in the marketplace. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole at the moment of low cost technically acceptable versus a true value-based price. So I can tell you a lot of times when I'm looking at something personally or when I'm buying something for my business, I really look at what's the overall value. Okay, that one is less expensive now, but the quality is lower. I'm looking online, the reviews are lower. So yeah, maybe I save a few bucks now or what even may appear to be a lot of bucks right now. But the overall value long term, I'm going to have to replace that sooner or it's going to have more repairs. Maybe I get a higher quality product with a better warranty over here. And so, yes, it costs me more on the front end, but it's going to last me longer and be a better overall value for me. And so that's also something that when you're putting together your proposals and your pricing, right, to consider, and part of what you need to sell your customer is, okay, here is our price, but here's everything that makes up that price. This is our warranty, this is our past performance and other things. On your cost proposals, and especially again in cost type work, right, we're putting together a forecast of project costs for budgeting purposes. Again, we know there are modifications that come back and government or prime will add dollars to these cost type contracts, but not always. But it is a financial plan for managing the project. It is that basis for pricing that we've talked about. Our structure for our cost proposals, and I would like to just reiterate here, I don't think we added a slide on this, but I do want to reiterate with cost, really with any proposal, with price or cost, make sure that you're putting it in the format that's been requested. Again, I've seen people want to and part of it is they think they're protecting some competitive edge. They think that they're hiding something that, and maybe they are hiding something they don't want the government or prime to know. They think maybe they're going to slip something in. But let me tell you, there are pretty smart cost analysts and auditors on the other side who will pick up on these things. And so make sure that you're submitting a proposal with everything in it. But also, again, on the flip side of this, if you're the contractor evaluating proposals, right, look for those things. Did the supplier give you all of the information in the requested and necessary format for you to be able to do an appropriate price or cost analysis? Did they give you the proper breakdown for all of the labor, material, travel, ODCs, and subcontractors? Did they give you the appropriate indirect rates, right, and did they apply them correctly in the proposal, right? Did they apply fringe correctly to all of the labor? Did they apply overhead to the correct items? And when we start talking about applying those indirect rates, as I said earlier, that's where we sometimes see problems, is that people don't apply overhead, G&A, or the material and subcontract handling correctly to the underlying cost elements. And so they'll apply it, and you could do the math, and you could say, okay, I've multiplied these through the way they multiplied them, and I get to that number. But you might look at it and say, well, wait a minute, why are they applying, for example, if they have an MSOH, why are they applying MSOH and G&A to materials, right? They shouldn't be doing that. If they've got an MSOH, they should only be applying MSOH to materials, not MSOH and G&A as an example. Again, where somebody could have done something wrong, and you need to evaluate not just what their math is, but what's the logic of the math. Is it correct? So really important to have a compliance matrix. I hope that people are using a compliance matrix, and I've seen various versions and approaches to it. But basically, you want to go through the RFP, you want to go through any specs or other requirements. And again, these could be separate documents. So we're not just looking at what are the RFP things that I'm supposed to be doing, but also what are the actual specifications in the SAL or other documents that I'm supposed to do. And then I'm building a matrix and I'm saying, okay, here is my response, here is how I'm solving that problem, or here's the form that I completed. But then also making sure that you've got people assigned that's responsible for that, and also showing in your proposal where you've put that information. Those are some key parts of a compliance matrix. It helps with collaboration. We've got clear assignment of those responsibilities. It also helps with the review of our proposal, so we can have somebody else inside the organization review it, cross-check it, and say, yes, here's everything that you were supposed to do. Here's all your answers. Here's all your documents. I want to talk a little bit really quickly about the basis of estimate. I'm going to throw a quick polling question up here so we get this on the screen. This next polling question, number 5, what is the purpose of a basis of estimate in government contracting? A, to outline the contractor's marketing plan. B, to detail the project management approach. C, to provide a detailed rationale for the price. Or D, to serve as a legal contract. All right, I'm gonna, just for time's sake, because I'm gonna get on to the rest of our slides here and try to finish this out, go ahead and publish the result. The answer is C, to provide a detailed rationale for the price. And we'll get back to that here on our slides. So our basis of estimate, it needs to be a comprehensive document of facts, assumptions, and methodologies. One of the other things that I tell people is that the B of E needs to be commensurate with the size and complexity of the project that you're proposing. For example, if you're proposing a $100,000 project, could very well be a short B of E, right? I mean, it could be 3 or 4 labor categories and a few things to describe how you came up with the number of hours that was required and how you got to $100,000. If it's $1 million project, probably need a little more work. And if it's a $10 million project, you probably need even a little more work, right? So again, keep in mind that the size and complexity, and by size, I mean also dollar values, and by complexity, I mean like the technical complexity of what it is that you're doing, whether it's a service or providing a product. But that combination of like dollar value and complexity, the more there is, then the more there should be in your B of E. And again, the B of E should be lined up with by product or phase or location, by labor category, by CLIN, whatever that layout is, and not only commensurate with the size and complexity of the overall project, but also with the size and complexity of each CLIN or labor category. For example, if you've got a labor category in there and you're going to spend $100,000 over 3 years, again, do you need something to describe what that is? Absolutely. If you've got a labor category in there that's, $700,000 in 1 year, you probably need a lot more in the description of that labor category versus the other one that was $100,000 over 3 years, right? There's a bunch more hours. How did you get to those number of hours, right? Very, very important to have that kind of information. And again, this is where I see clients get in trouble and where they've called us, like the one that I mentioned earlier. Actually, they hadn't put together a B of E. They took the $10 million, divided by some rates, came up to some hours, multiplied it back through, and gave a price to the customer and said, here it is. And the moment the cost analyst people on the other side started asking questions, well, it all fell apart, right? So we need to say, okay, what is it that we're being asked to deliver? What is that level of effort? What materials do we need? What labor categories? How many? And be able to justify those through. And there are various techniques to justify that. But we need to be able to justify that through, right, and be able to support, right, any type of fact-finding, cost analysis audit of our proposal. This can include historical data, quotes, actual prices that underpin the cost estimates. We can have similar to data of how we did the same or similar product or service in the past. We need to document assumptions, right? Where there may be, hey, we've done something similar before. We think this is 10% more complex, so we put 10% more hours, and this is why, right? There's this unknown. You've asked us to do this aspect that we've never done that particular thing before, and so there's an unknown aspect of it, and that's okay. Those can be part of the assumptions. We need to talk about how specific methodologies that we use. Did we do parametric modeling, engineering estimates? Do we have vendor quotes to support this type of information? Our CPSR documentation, I want to get back to this really quickly, just when we talk about overall of price analysis. But also, again, I like to tell people, again, look at this from both sides of the table. Even if you're in a situation where you're submitting the proposal and you're not doing the CPSR documentation, remember that your prime may have to do that, right? They may have a formal CPSR and they have to do this stuff, and you need to help them. I don't want to say fill their file because I don't like that phrase, but you need to help them support their evaluation and determination of you, right? And so when you understand what they're looking for, you can help them with that. They need, for example, their purchase requisition or MRP requirements. They need a copy of their RFQ that they sent out to suppliers. So some of this is on their side, or it's on your side if you're performing this evaluation, right? Who did they send it to? Date that it was sent out. Now they need copies of the proposals and bids, including responses for no bids. They need the price analysis. This is where you can be key, even if you're the seller, right? So you're not only providing your proposal, but you're helping them to defend and to make that determination fair and reasonable price. You're helping them with that. You're going to be helping them with negotiations, right? And so you do have a role in this, even if you are the seller. Our last polling question, I'm going to put it on the screen, and then I've got a couple of just really quick closeout items, and then I'll ask Debbie to come back on if she's got any closing remarks. Polling question here, give you an opportunity. After this presentation, how would you rate your understanding of cost and price analysis? I'm an expert. I understand it much better. I have a basic understanding, or I might need to review the material again. Obviously, no right or wrong question here, just trying to gauge and give people an opportunity to participate. Debbie, if you want to unmute and turn your video back on as well, we'll get you back on the screen here in just a moment. Give people just another few seconds to respond to this polling question in case they need it for their CPE certificates. I do see a couple of questions. Let me flip over to that. Has there been an instance where the prime ceased doing business with their sub when the sub continually did not provide compliant proposals? Yes, I have seen that. I have absolutely seen that happen where the prime said, look, you're become difficult to deal with. You don't respond to stuff. You don't give us what we need. You're dragging out. And part of sometimes what we've seen is that they've said, look, you're dragging out the process. You're affecting our schedule and stuff. And so we're going to find another supplier who can play the game and play it better than you can. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll. I do want to thank Debbie for giving a quick shout out in the beginning to my book. I appreciate that, Debbie. And we've had similar feedback that people have said, hey, and it was obviously my goal to make this an easily readable, digestible book. I had others in the industry who came back and said, wow, your section on the cost accounting standards is the easiest to understand of anything that I've come across. You can get the book on Amazon. We'll have, again, the PowerPoint in the follow-up email that goes out. We'll get CPE certificates out to people who qualified for them. And the video link will also be in the follow-up. And with that, Debbie, I'll turn it over to you for any final comments.
Thank you, Robert. Very informative. I got a lot of information out of it myself, and I know most of this material. So I got a lot out of it too. And I hope everyone else did as well. Those of you who did answer the polling question do expect to get a certificate from Left Brain Professionals. And I want to thank Left Brain Professionals immensely. They've helped me a lot in the last couple of weeks getting this thing rescheduled and reset up and getting everybody back on track for this webinar. So thank you again for all your help to get done. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to let me know. I will be happy to pass on anything to Robert. If anybody else has any other questions, please do ask them in the Q&A now before we end this. Looks like they have a couple people on who were asking about the poll for number 6.
Yeah, I can't say what happened, and unfortunately, it doesn't give me an opportunity to turn the poll question on again. I apologize for that. If you think you should have gotten a CPE and you didn't, just let us know and we can go back and review everything.
Looks like there's no additional questions. I thank you again, Robert, and thank your team for all their support. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity, and everybody have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.